about you, but I find that too many people spend far too much time around me engrossed in one sort of fantasy or another. Whether it's a TV show or a football game or whatever it happens to be, they're all engrossed in one thing or another. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today on the Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. The subject was going to be fantasy, or is going to be fantasy and reality. I'm your host, by the way. I'm Kurt. Today is Monday, the 10th of May of 2021. Glad to have everybody along, whether on Rumble, on the YouTube, on podcast, on YouTube, on the podcast, or wherever you happen to be coming from. So as I say, I'm reading my notes here, and it's just a very quick and dirty thing in a way, but it's a little bit longer. It says, too many people spend far too much time or of their time engrossed in one sort of fantasy or another. The thing is, you can extol the virtue of something like the Black Panther movie, or movies, however many, but reality is not that. That's not reality, like it or not. Should we be aiming for a more perfect reality? Of course. Who could argue that we shouldn't, right? Are you willing to let somebody else attempt to show you how that ought to look? Look, it doesn't hurt for you to look at it if they show that, but I'm going to bet you that if you really think about what they're saying, you're going to find that it shouldn't look like they think it ought to. And that's particularly true if the reality they present is not possible. The answer on your part to whether or not you should be willing to look at what they're saying and accept it full-throatedly is no, in my opinion. We should seek to make changes that are possible, and we shouldn't probably be assuming that the changes that we're going to make are going to be ideal. I'm not saying that'll never happen. I'm just saying generally it won't. In the end, maybe we'll reach some paragon of reality, right? Maybe that'll happen. As for me, I don't really expect that to be the case. I just don't think it'll happen. It's really pretty simple. You can spend time in fantasy all you want. And so long as you remember that you're spending your time in fantasy, that's fine, I suppose. In my mind, I don't really consider it a good idea. I don't consider it a good idea for you to spend your time in fantasy. I really think that for most people, at least until they've got a pretty good grasp on reality, they probably should spend less time in a fantasy world. Now, let's be fair. My son spends a lot of his time in fantasy, but I make it quite clear to him that he's doing so, and I tell him, Bud, that's not real. That stuff you're watching, it's not real. Okay? I tell him this all the time. And sometimes I say, yeah, that's not real, but that could actually happen. And other times I tell him, that's not real, and that'll never happen. I ask him questions like, have you ever really, really, really in real life seen a talking dog or cat? No? Then various of the critters that you see on TV, they're obviously not real. The point of all of this is that you can look at fantasy all day long and wish that the world was that way. Wishing will not make it so. I'm sure you've heard this expression before. I'm sure I'm not the first one to give you this idea. Wishing for fantasies will not make them so. And let me just tell you something. You should probably be pretty glad of that. Why? Because, as I say, a lot of fantasies that people present are not all they're cracked up to be. There is this tendency towards desiring a utopian society, and unfortunately, what it actually does is it makes it so that people fail to realize that there are reasons that disruptive and annoying and frustrating things happen in your life. Yeah, you don't like that guy with a jackhammer beating down on the roadway to try and get to the pipes that are underneath. But if he's not there, your pipes don't get fixed. This assumption or this idea that you never need to do a jackhammer run or never have to have a road blocked off or whatever is a lovely idea, but it's not reality. That's fantasy, boys and girls. And when it comes right down to it, if you want things that work, you have to have people that make them work. And you have to have them doing things that are inconvenient in the process. In fact, you may be one of those people. And by the way, I should thank you if you are, because again, you're doing things that people need. Thank you very much. That's a very nice thing that you're doing that. I know. You're doing it for the paycheck. I get it. Beside the point. Still, you're doing things that are meaningful and worthwhile for those people who are around you, and you are not in a fantasy world when you're doing that. Or if you are, you're in a fantasy world and still doing the job, which I suppose I can live with. But I'm going to say this again. If you walk around with your head in the clouds all the time and you don't pay attention to reality, bad things will happen, right? How many times have people talked about the idea of somebody who was walking along somewhere, phone in hand, not looking where they were going, and suddenly disappeared from the street below only to drop 10 feet down into a manhole? How many times has something like that happened? How many times has a person had their head buried in a book and started walking across the street and only to realize that they were walking directly in front of a bus and the bus couldn't stop before it hit them? How many times has that happened, do you suppose, various places? My point is simple. Even seemingly innocuous non-reality that takes you away from the present moment may be enough to literally destroy your life, if not forever, for a very long time in the future. You need to face reality. See, am I saying you can never have any time in fantasy? No, I'm not saying that. I have to tell you something. I really don't do fantasy, as a rule. I'm not saying I never do, but it's pretty rare. And the reason for that is I realize that the more time I spend in reality, the more time I can spend shaping reality to what I want it to look like. This is the sort of thing that you must attune yourself to. You must tune yourself into it, not atone. Atone is to make up for. I'm saying you should push yourself into that. For those of you that are listening, I just made a hand motion where I showed myself cutting through the nonsense, basically, and maybe people need the descriptive anyway. Sometimes my hand motions aren't maybe the best. But anyway, pushing through and cutting through the nonsense and getting to reality and making reality what you want it. Sometimes reality is no fun, let's face it. But the thing about it is, the less time you spend there, the less fun it's probably going to be. I just want you to know that. This is just how things are going to work. I used to really like fantasy. I used to write fantasy stories myself, and I never wrote anything that was published or all that fantastic. But I used to write fantasy stories. I started to write fantasy stories, and I had people who I'm quite sure thought I had a promising career in fantasy literature. But I came to a conclusion over the course of time, and I want to clue you into this. Reality, when you ignore it, doesn't tend to get better. It doesn't tend to get better. It gets worse if you ignore it. If you take care of it and learn how to live with the various things that are going on in your life, reality will get better. If you live in a world where you're in fantasy 95% of the time, guess what? The chances are exceptionally good things are not going to go well for you. Okay? That's just the reality. Forget how they go in your fantasy world. They may go fantastic in your fantasy world, but if you're not eating, your fantasy world is going to start to become less and less important, and reality is going to draw you back. And while I'm at it, I want to include things like use of alcohol, drugs, and various things of that sort into this process. It's not just Wakanda forever that's the problem. No, there are people doing all kinds of things that take them temporarily out of reality and make it impossible for them to focus on the things, excuse me for confusing my words for a minute there, focus on the things that they need to in order to have a good and fulfilling life. This is important. This is what you need to understand. I get that you want to involve yourself in fantasy. I'm not telling you you can't do that. I'm not telling you you shouldn't do that. I can't tell you you can't do that. I'm not telling you you shouldn't ever do that. But I am telling you that the more you involve yourself with reality and the more you work to make things into what you want them to be, the better they will be. And this is why when I talk about fantasy and reality, I tell you most of the time that you spend should be spent in reality, not fantasy. All right, I need to go ahead and wrap up for the day. As I've said, this is the Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. I'm your host. I'm Kurt. Today is Monday, the 10th of May of 2021. That means tomorrow will be Tuesday, the 11th of May of 2021. We've talked about fantasy and reality today, and tomorrow we're going to discuss the idea of traffic stop. and you're maybe wondering what I'm talking about. You'll see, but basically what I want to do is give some people a good dose of, funnily enough, reality. I want you to really think about what it is that I say in tomorrow's daily summation, but obviously you're not going to be able to do that until tomorrow, so I'm going to go ahead and leave you now and let you get about your day, and I'm going to go ahead and get about mine. I've got 2 or 3 things that I need to do before I get to do yet more things that I have to do in my life. That's just life, and that's how it works. Hopefully things are going well for you, and hopefully we will see you again on tomorrow's daily summation. The speaker on this edition of the Daily Summation is Kurt Schubert. This video was recorded on Monday, the 10th of May of 2021. The Daily Summation is created for Kurt's Religion and Politics. Thanks for watching this edition of the Daily Summation from Kurt's Religion and Politics. I hope you found it entertaining or instructional, or maybe both. If you want to see more from me, you can go to blogs.kpschubert.com. That's blogs.kpschubert.com. I am on Twitter, Parler, and Minds.com. My handle on each of those is @kpschubert. That's @kpschubert. I have a Rumble and a YouTube channel. They are the Kurt's Religion and Politics channels on Rumble and YouTube. I have a Facebook page. The Facebook page is Kurt's Religion and Politics as well. I am on Patreon. If you want to support me, that's one of the better places you can do that. And you will find me at Kurt's Religion and Politics on Patreon. I have a podcast. The podcast is podcasts with an S. .kpschubert.com. That's podcasts.kpschubert.com. I think you should be able to find me with relative ease on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify as well. The best way I find to do that is to look for Kurt's Religion and Politics. You can try to use the Daily Summation. I find that it doesn't work as well as a general rule, but you can always try that. I'm glad to have you aboard today, and hopefully we will see you again tomorrow.